Hello, Úna Brosnan. I would very much like to welcome you to Cornucopia Climate Chats, where we talk about all things climate related for the Cornucopia customers. And today we're talking about renewable energy because that is the area that you have specialized in your working life, or I assume your recent working life. And I know you through a cousin of mine who worked in a company with you called Mainstream. So you're very welcome, Una, and I'd love to ask you a little bit about your background and how you got involved in all this climate and renewables.
Thank you very much, Deirdre and Cornucopia, for having me on the podcast. I'm delighted to share my experience, my background, and looking forward to the chat. I think it's really important to get involved in some of these discussions, just to get the word out and where the opportunities are, why we're doing this, and it's great to have an opportunity to speak directly to your customers as well.
Thank you so much. In your LinkedIn description, you describe yourself as a climate optimist. And that's one thing that I want to be is optimistic. I'm famous for being optimistic. Can you tell us why you're a climate optimist and of how you've, despite all the mud that's slung?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very much a person who loves a challenge. In respect to climate, I think, look, we've no bigger challenge than what we have in front of us right now, trying to mitigate against an impactful rolling picture in front of us and ever-growing concern around what it means for particularly those frontline, as I call them, frontline countries. I've been involved. I'm an engineer by background, and I suppose that's kind of drove me very much into the optimist side. I really do believe in science and engineering and the power of innovation, and that is something I've been involved heavily over the duration of my career. Yeah, I suppose going back into my childhood as well. I'm from Kerry, farming background, so very much close to the environment and obviously understanding a lot about growing your own food and getting involved in the engineering side. A lot of my family would do their own innovative adaptations or innovative elements on some of the machinery we would have used at farm level. And growing up, and we would have been actively involved in everything from, raising the animals right to dealing with machinery and trying to solve some of those projects. A number of my family are heavily involved in the engineering side. And in the early days, I worked in roads and bridges on both the design and the construction side. And I really was keen and I was studying by night in renewables. So it was something I really was passionate about. When the Celtic Tiger, I suppose, genuflected a little in 2007, 2008, 2009, I really was starting to focus my mind on where I wanted to go, what next. I mean, we were in a very difficult position in Ireland. So it was a decision I made to go abroad and study renewable energy. So I went to Edinburgh and kind of saw an opportunity there to really make a difference, combining climate with my passion for engineering and work with a previous employer called Atkins to build a business around offshore wind. So, from the optimist side, innovation is central to that. And I really do think we have a very optimistic that we can use science and engineering here. And then it's the power of translation, translating that from some of the great minds and people involved in engineering and science to be able to translate that across to the public and to give them the evidence base to make sure that they understand this and see the importance of embracing some of these new approaches.
Yeah, so renewable energy is what we're talking about. What do you understand by the word renewable energy, I suppose, as opposed to what we've traditionally had?
Traditionally, obviously, we're very much orientated around burning some form. This renewable energy in particular is all about harnessing natural resources, which can be replenished naturally. So you're thinking of wind, whether it's onshore or offshore, water, looking at the marine environment, air, geothermal, and then even going across into organic matter. So renewables very much is orientated, really deeply entrenched in that replenishment and being able to replenish that naturally. So it's something, why not? It's there, it's free, it's an opportunity to take, nature and bring nature into the heart of what we do. But, we do need to recognize it doesn't come without its trade-offs, like every industry there. The production and utilization of renewable energy systems involve reduced environmental impact. It's not completely mitigated. We do have things like material extraction, manufacturing. We're still using steel and concrete. But what we're trying to do is being very mindful about how we do our manufacturing. Is there opportunities for green steels, that steel which is produced using renewable energy sources? Is there an opportunity for us to maximize opportunities in innovation around new materials and how we do things, the how and the why you would do things, how we can be more efficient and drive sustainability into everything we do in that process?
I was listening to a TED talk today where they said the difference between fossil fuels were a commodity and renewable energy is really about technology. And I thought
Mhm.
that was a very interesting point because commodities naturally fluctuate in price, whereas technology inevitably makes things cheaper in the longer term. And I thought that it does seem that from an economic point of view, though it's a bumpy road to get there, and capitalism follows economy and economics and profit, and that's the system we have, it seems inevitable that renewables will win the profit race. Just wonder what you think about that.
It certainly is technology driven. We've seen fantastic innovations over the last probably 20, 30 years, and it's still an ongoing challenge. Energy and commodity, very technology came to the forefront in recent years when you see the price of energy rising. You've seen oil break some new barriers, particularly around, I suppose, the geopolitical conflicts really have brought this to the forefront, where we're obtaining our oil, how the fluctuations affect us, really down to a granular level. And you see the impact it has and still is having on our cost of living. So recognizing that embracing renewable energy is key into stabilizing prices around how we generate energy, but equally then driving energy security. So it's making sure that we are in charge of our own destiny in respect to energy pricing, in respect to cost of living as well. So it is really imperative that we start thinking hard about how renewable energy, how we can bring this on the grid. It underpins everything in what we do here in Ireland and abroad. It has tentacles into every single industry, every single process that we do.
Tentacles into every part of our life.
Yeah, every part of our life is right.
What you're saying then, Una, is that renewable energy will give people more energy security. And
Yes.
the longer term, it'll be more sort of democratic and it'll be more available to people. Obviously, there needs to be a lot of backup from governments. And referring to the company Mainstream that you worked for, I did a little bit of research on that, and it seemed that Ireland wasn't quite ready with its ports and its backup technology and its grid in order to allow a company to actually introduce the wind energy.
Yeah, I mean, Ireland has made great inroads on the onshore side, particularly in wind and more recently solar projects. But we've a lot to do. I mean, go back to Mainstream's earlier days and its founder in particular, Eddie O'Connor, quite an inspiration. And one of the reasons I went into renewable energy, Eddie had a great vision for Ireland and globally. And that vision continues, with his family legacy and with the companies he set up and very much orientated around embracing that technology and that vision for decarbonisation. It's an inspirational story, and the passion and dedication to that vision has been extraordinary, and that's instilled into his family, and they're looking to continue this. Obviously, Eddie passed away sadly in January this year, but his legacy really is instilled, as I say, into the family, but equally into all his employees and colleagues and industry supporters as well. That is continuing. You see that with his company Supernode, which is really embracing cutting edge technology and superconducting technology. And equally, then Mainstream is moving into numerous markets globally as well and decarbonizing a number of economies and has had a lot of success there. But, there's an awful lot to do. This is more than just a company, this is more than just an individual. We need to make sure that we are able to translate that vision into layman's terms and we make sure that we can embrace the technology and really lean into some of the levers to unlock those technology advancements and bring them in on a policy and regulatory framework. This is the chicken and the egg. It goes back to we need to build a business case for Ireland, in particular, when we're looking at renewable energy. It needs to be all the good things that you learn in business school or even in primary and secondary. You need to have a proper and robust business case to invest in these projects. So things like visibility of pipelines, so having an idea of where your next project is going to come. Because, in particular, if you're going to build a supply chain to support a new industry in renewables, you need to be able to understand, well, okay, I'm a supply chain. I want to invest in this. Well, where's my next project going to come from? How am I going to build on this? How do I get my returns? And then when it comes to getting investment into the project itself, it needs to be a robust business case from a financial perspective and a risk perspective. So from
Yeah,
the minute we have a project,
yeah.
we de-risk it.
Now, does the state, excuse my ignorance, does the
Yeah.
state provide any funds for this, or what role does the state play? Or is it
So
private enterprise that will bring renewables to Ireland.
Going back to the business case, it's really important that the state has confidence and it maintains a steady line of support into projects to secure that huge investment to build a project. In Ireland, we have something called ORES for offshore or RES for the onshore side. But what that does is give a buffer. It is a form of subsidy. Whether it's drawn upon, that depends on electricity pricing and the bid prices into these projects. Initially, you'll see some high prices, particularly you'll see them in the UK, where the early days of the likes of offshore were significantly higher. They would have drawn on the subsidies, but that subsidy then is really back into building your industry. As the industry matures and as you get volume and you get scale, you get cost reduction. And that's where you're seeing the prices now come down considerably. I mean, onshore wind is pretty competitive alongside solar, and offshore wind has come down considerably and exceeded some of the government challenges into cost reduction we've seen here in the UK in particular.
What percentage of the world's electricity at the moment, just being at the big picture,
Yeah.
are from renewables? And then in Ireland, just to give people a view on that.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one because we're not as renewable successful as I would have liked us to be. Looking at the stats, actually, we're only about 15% of the world total energy consumption comes from renewable resources. It's
Percent.
quite frightening. Yeah, and that's across electricity generation, transport, fuel, heating, cooling, depending on what part of the world you were in. We've considerable work to do there. We do need to recognize that there is areas of the world as well that don't have access to electricity. And we need to be mindful that these parts of the world in fast-paced development areas will need power and you will see large-scale development in the next couple of decades.
When people talk about a gap in the market, there's an absolute
Yeah.
huge amount of work to be done. Inevitable, the writing is on the wall that fossil fuel will be on its way out and renewables are on the way in. And that, it might be a rocky road and a bumpy road
Mhm.
backwards and forwards, but it's an inevitable trend that
Yeah, you've seen things like obviously with the recent COP in Baku, but over the last couple of decades, we've seen things like the Paris Agreement come in, where they have a global agreement which is very much focused around maintaining a 1.5 degree Celsius level where we don't exceed that above pre-industrial levels. This is really pushing the shift away from fossil fuels and significantly increasing renewable energy. And we have seen that taken on by a number of nations or blocks when it comes to the EU. Number of countries have 2030, 2040, 2050 targets, renewable targets, or technology targets in some cases. And we do have multiple organizations. I suppose one that springs to mind is IRENA, or the International Renewable Energy Agency, which is heavily promoting the adoption of sustainable use of renewable energy. But underneath IRENA, then there's a multitude of various organizations like GWEC, which is the Global Wind Energy Association, and then they have various bodies or associations sitting alongside them, like Ocean Energy Pathways or Global Offshore Wind Alliance. They work with nations then to set targets firstly and then adopt it and then really drive impact into communities in particular. We're really looking at the community side. How do we get down to grassroots and make sure that we have the social license as well to build these projects?
it's an interesting word you use, social license. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. I mean, social license is very much around the operation and the ability to build these projects. If you don't have a social license, generally you're seeing projects which will be delayed considerably. And depending on which jurisdiction you're in, it could be taken through the court systems, which can be quite lengthy and expensive, to say the least. But generally, at the root of these challenges is actually communities not understanding the requirement or not understanding the technology or de-risking. But equally, the onus needs to come back to developers as well to make sure that they speak and take that proactive step with communities and really, really engage. How do you make sure that there is benefit for all involved in the area in particular? Understanding the why, understanding what it means, how it will operate, decommissioning these, how we will maintain them. I think it's really important to get down to the nitty-gritty on how these are built.
Can you give us an example in Ireland of renewable energy that did or didn't have this social agreement? Or anything that just to make it
Yeah, I'll probably steer away from naming projects, but I mean, look, we've got a number of projects in the pipeline at the minute for planning on the onshore side. but we do have a lot going through judicial review. They've been held up in planning. They cannot proceed through the system. So until those are resolved, they are being challenged from various from
Environmental impact. No,
yeah, environmental impact. And, you need to make sure that you're following due process as well. Some of these may not have ticked all the boxes, and maybe there's a flaw in the system on their part or on the government side. So this is where it comes down to robust policy and mechanisms, making sure that we're adopting best practice, we're adopting international standards, and we're taking the lessons learned. Areas like not having enough data, particularly around environmental impact when it comes to birds and mammals. This is an onus now very much in the developers' box, is making sure that we as developers, when we're looking at projects, that we have to collect the right amount of data, that we can have baseline data for, say, birds and mammals, particularly in offshore. You're looking at maybe 2 years of this, particularly in the offshore side. But then you can have a conversation around whether it is impacting, what is the level of impact, and how do you mitigate this if it is to be taken forward.
can I ask you how much renewables we use in Ireland at the moment?
Yeah, Ireland has done very well, to be fair. I mean, it really raced to the forefront of the eye in Europe in particular. So we were on over 40% of Ireland's electricity is coming from renewable sources. And that is very positive. But we do have a big hill ahead of us. In particular, we do have challenges around grid. We are having curtailment issues. Ireland has some of the most expensive electricity in Europe at the minute. And that is what we need to unlock over the next decade. To be honest, it's even quicker than that because we need to make sure that we can bring down the cost of any electricity here.
Why do we have the most expensive electricity, in your opinion?
Look, we've had some underinvestment in enabling infrastructure. And what I mean by enabling infrastructure is very much around the grid comes to the forefront. We need to strengthen our grid and we need to do this at pace so we can bring on these renewable energy projects. There's some really good penetration of onshore wind and solar in Ireland, but it isn't enough. We've got traditional power stations in Ireland, which will be cycling off because of the end of their life, but you need to make sure that we have enough stable power coming on board. So that's bringing a diversity in the mix, but equally having the grid's ability to take that power. Renewable energy, it operates differently on the grid as well. So we need to be able to balance that and look at things like storage when it comes to batteries and making sure that we have enough of them to keep the lights on and keep a stable grid.
Who is responsible for building the harbours, building the grid, all that to allow us to take on this lovely renewable energy, which will be cheaper? Who is behind that?
I very much think it's a collective action between private sector and governments. In Ireland, we've got a number of departments, in particular for renewable energy. It cuts across a number of government departments. So there is quite a bit of stakeholder engagement. When it comes to the port side, you're looking at the marine environment, you're looking at infrastructure, you're looking at getting licensing from, first of all, you're looking at the policy and regulatory framework, which will come from the Department of Climate Change. Department of Transport then will be heavily involved from a ports perspective. And business side of it, you would have the Department of Enterprise or DETI. It's quite a multitude of stakeholders from a government side. And then on the other side, you'll have semi-states or private entities which will own the ports and be responsible then from a strategic perspective on where they need to grow, how they grow, and making sure that you have a return on your investment and is the right thing to do for the consumer as well. We've got the CRU making sure that we drive value in everything we do at government level.
What's the CRU?
Basically, this is a regulatory authority in Ireland. So they look out for the best interests of the customer and making sure that any of the policy and regulatory framework that we put forward, looking at, say, offshore wind, decoupling some of the assets from the developers, say on the transmission side, that'd be something the CRU would give guidance on, and making sure that we are driving value into the investments that are being made in renewable energy, but equally we're mindful of that price of electricity as well.
Well, I'm glad the CRU exists.
Every industry, of this nature needs something. It's monitoring, it's guiding, it's regulating what's happening out there because we need to make sure, you talked about capitalism, you need to make sure that the customer is not paying this at the end of the day. And that is imperative. We see private entities coming in as developers. We need to make sure that we're streamlining technology. We're getting the best value there. Yes, some of the technology will be expensive in the early days of building an industry, but how we do cost reduction and how we take the lessons learned from other projects, that is imperative that we get the costs down and get that return for the customers.
Yeah, very good. I've been obviously doing a bit of research and going down the rabbit hole of offshore wind energy, which is your specialism. Can you explain what a megawatt is and how much electricity a megawatt? Because we talk about, different, obviously I know what a watt is. I have a 60-watt bulb or a 100-watt bulb. But when you have a megawatt and when you're talking about these huge turbines, one turn of these massive turbines, which are as big as the Eiffel Tower, it seems,
Yep.
seem to produce megawatts. And what are they? So people get a sense of how much electricity there's potentially there from our windy offshores.
There's different levers and different, I suppose, different amounts of electricity that could come out from a megawatt. So you have turbines onshore at the minute, which I suppose the historic ones would probably be around anything from a kilowatt, which you might see on a local farm, anything up to maybe a commercial one, which would be starting, and the older ones would have been probably maybe 1 to 2 megawatts. And now you're seeing the bigger ones come on board, the 3, the 4 megawatts. In some very, very remote areas, you may see them get a little bit bigger. These turbines generate basically the turnover we classify it as megawatt hour. And you could be looking at 1 megawatt hour would supply maybe anything from 500 to 1,000 households per hour. So that's just an indication. The criteria then comes back to, well, how good is your wind? Is it, and Ireland has some amazing wind because we've very little disruption coming in from even America. You've got quite a fish of sea there. So having what I call sweet wind, where you've got less turbulence there, you've got less interruption from buildings, you've got interruption from obviously mountains, and then obviously making sure that you can keep the wind consistent when it hits the technology, basically. It's quite an interesting one. The technology has driven efficiency. So you are seeing the megawatt hours increase because the turbines are getting better at what they do. We're learning more. We're driving further efficiencies into changing the drivetrain technology in particular. You've seen direct drive come in, which is reducing the mechanical elements in there to really inject efficiency into what you get for every single turn of that onshore or offshore wind turbine. You get more value out of it. And I'll give you an example on, say, some of the efficiencies we see from onshore to offshore. In onshore, you have a factor called capacity factor. Onshore, you see about 30%. So 30% of the wind hitting the turbine is converted into electricity. And that might seem very low, but this is where I talk about the efficiencies. That is growing as technology is improving. In offshore, initially we would see offshore wind or fixed bottom offshore wind in particular probably be around the 40, 45. That has improved and probably broken the 50% factor. But actually, as we move into floating wind, which is a next generation technology of offshore wind, moving fixed to floating, we are seeing actually incredible increases again into, 55 and potentially even 60% capacity factors. Because you're going further offshore, you've got less interruption, hence less turbulence. So hence that's where I mean it's not a dead fact on how many houses you're going to be powering or how many megawatt hours you're generating. It really depends on your location, the speed of the wind, the turbulence, and obviously the efficiencies of the turbines as well and how it's operated.
One of the things I looked at was the map of Ireland, and then I looked at the real map of Ireland, and I was amazed because the real map of Ireland includes our seabeds, what we have the right to use. And it's, I don't know how many times the size of our land, our sea, and this is potentially there for us in floating wind turbines to produce more energy than we ever could need. And with the proper international grids, we could be exporting this. Our economy could be booming from exporting our wind energy. That's the sort of dream. Or am I talking through my hat?
No, absolutely. And this is something I'm trying to support in the background to see how we unlock this opportunity. So Ireland has technical potential. And when I say technical potential, it's looking at where some of the constraints are. It potentially could have about 50 gigawatts of offshore wind. We don't need 50 gigawatts. Ireland's demand is 5 to 6 gigawatts at the minute, but that is growing and is going to grow considerably over the next couple of decades, particularly on our way to 2050. We need to decarbonise Ireland, of course, first. We need to look at, say, the domestic decarbonisation, but then obviously the industrial side and the industrial opportunities. But then there are other opportunities wider as well, not maybe looking at electricity, looking at things like power to X.
What's power to X?
Power to X would be very much looking at using the wind resource to produce commodity elements like green hydrogen, which would then be used by heavy industrial users to decarbonize some of the hard to abate industries. And then equally, you could be looking at ammonia. You could be looking at wider potential then around decarbonizing the marine industry, looking at, as I say, that heavy industry as well, which is hard to abate. But if you were looking at floating in particular, and just to give you an idea of the opportunity, the Atlantic itself could have opportunity to unlock 30 gigawatts of floating wind.
Our territory in the Atlantic,
Our
Ireland.
territory, yes, absolutely. Which
So
brings a great opportunity.
our sea territory is an incredible resource, which we've traditionally thought of for fish. But
Yeah.
now it's a resource for producing energy, which we could export, which would be very good for our economy.
Absolutely, absolutely. We do need to be mindful that this is a huge engineering challenge as well. The Atlantic is turbulent. It's quite onerous environment to be working in, and Ireland hasn't got that pedigree in working in an offshore environment. But we do have great expertise who are Irish and working abroad and working internationally in this. But we have a great marine expertise and professional services looking at digital. So the opportunity from a social and economic perspective is really, really compelling for Ireland to embrace offshore wind and particularly a floating wind, where we would look at bringing more jobs more regionally into maybe the west of Ireland or the south of Ireland. And again, bringing diversification into not only our electricity side, but underpinning our industries as well. We are seeing things like the decarbonisation is very much at the forefront for every investment that comes into Ireland, whether it's pharmaceutical or looking at the digital side for data centres. They are all equally looking at things like electricity prices, the cost of electricity. And I'll link that back to our most expensive rate in Europe at the minute. It is imperative that we bring renewable energy onto the system to bring down that cost and make sure that we are competitive in Europe and competitive globally to attract and maintain the investment we have in Ireland. So it goes really down deep into the business case for Ireland Inc., really, and how important it is to make sure that we embrace this.
And talking about the fossil industry, what I don't understand, unless it's ideological, which can be really a sort of a damaging thing for profit,
Mhm.
why they're not all just doing a 360-degree turn and investing in renewables. Why is there this sense that you get that the fossil fuels are stuck in the past and blocking the development of renewable energy? And it seems very retrograde when the facts are sort of there in front of you. It's like coal is gone. It's a something locked asset, or there's a word for it, an asset that is no longer worth investing in. What's your opinion about that? The difficulty with change, or
I think it's a bit of everything, to be honest. There's been a heavy dependence internationally on coal and gas in particular. And obviously, gas is seen as a transition of fuel. So that has been heavily embraced. And it gets into our mindsets, it's in our policies and regulatory framework. It takes time to change policy and regulatory framework. Going back to the business case, there is a lot of investment internationally in assets which are orientated around fossil fuels. They're underpinning wider industry. That takes time to change. The business case may not always be there. Going back to how committed some of the governments are, how much are they leaning into their climate objectives, making sure that you can and have the policy and regulatory frameworks to make sure that you can get investment into some of these projects is really key. We've seen a lot of fossil fuel companies, the big petro companies come into offshore wind, I suppose in particular. They've dipped their head in. We've seen some of the prices. They come with big checkbooks. They have come involved, but that comes with a trade-off as well. They do have a depth of experience in the offshore side in particular, and the ability to move mega projects. And they have a wealth of experience, particularly on the engineering and the investment side. So it's hard to remove these from the discussion. We need to work with fossil fuel companies. A number of these investments, though, are coming to the end of their life. As I said, with this coal and gas generation, they do have life cycles of about 20, 25, or 30 years. You're also seeing exploration, particularly in oil and gas, getting harder. So the business case is becoming more difficult. So hence you are seeing scaling back naturally of investments in fossil fuels here, not just from a climate perspective, but just from a business perspective. They're struggling to get viability on their projects. You're seeing efficiencies being driven into sustainability, should I say, driven into industry as well. So the demand is starting to pull back. But you will always need some form of oil or gas in our economy. It's got tentacles into everything we do, whether it's plastic products or it's powering some of our cars. But we will need to make that commitment on how it fits into the mix and how we can make the business case support renewables on this one. It's quite a challenge, it's quite a trade-off, and it is heavily underpinned by our global policy and regulatory frameworks around how we want to operate.
So it's a transition. And one of
Absolutely.
the things I learned when I was studying my climate course was about just transition. And
Yeah.
things that take a while, but there's pressure on us to make that transition and to make it faster. I wanted to ask you a little bit about nuclear power. When
Mhm.
I was a student in the 1980s and 70s, it was very much an anti-nuclear world. And I just wonder, has it made any changes? It's something that I just have an instinctive hostility towards, but I just wonder what your opinion is on the role of nuclear.
Go back to the energy mix. In some countries, you need to have diversity in the mix. And we have, say, the likes of the UK, which has embraced nuclear. Scotland has pulled back from having any new nuclear in their jurisdiction. And that's a decision. And we need to weigh up the pros and cons. I do believe there will be an energy mix, but I think nuclear has quite a challenge ahead, the cost in particular. You have to give credit. The engineering challenge around building a nuclear plant is impressive, but the decommissioning side does personally worry me. And that's where my alliances, yeah, will be very much firm in renewables. It's what do we do with the nuclear waste afterwards? How do we safely store that? How do we safely neutralize that? And the length of time that it takes to do that is of concern. That is a personal thing for me. And it's a reason why I don't work in nuclear. I do have a lot of friends who do work in that side or have worked in that side. Embracing that, I have worked with some of these colleagues as well to bring some of the expertise, the engineering know-how across into renewables. And over the years, I've built teams which actually originated from nuclear and they've transitioned across, I suppose, understanding the challenge and understanding why they would like to work in the energy sector, but in offshore wind, in my case, the cost of nuclear is quite a challenge as well. We're waiting anxiously to see where the cost of nuclear really sits at the minute in the UK. Going back a few years, this is pre-COVID, we would have been looking at £90 per megawatt hour for the Hinkley Point C project, which is currently under construction in the UK, was considerably a lot more expensive than onshore wind and offshore wind. Offshore wind at that point, I think it was sub £60 per megawatt hour, which is quite a considerable difference. And the timeline it takes to build a nuclear plant as well is quite considerable. It takes minimum 10 to 15 years. You need to go through the policy and regulatory frameworks and making sure you get through your EIA, similar to the renewable side. We would be under the same scrutiny there, but it's the build out, it's the length of time that you need and the heavy infrastructure lift around that.
Is there still some support for nuclear energy in a transition, or would you be? I would hope that there wouldn't be, but I'm just wondering.
It's a point of contention, actually. In Europe, nuclear has been seen as a transition fuel. It's been classed as clean. That's very much a point of debate. I could be here all day debating that one. For me personally, I don't see nuclear as a renewable transition. It's different.
Okay, so moving on from that, I wanted to ask you what you thought about COP29. I know I'm dating this
Yeah.
podcast because it has just ended in the last few weeks, and I did see on LinkedIn that you wrote a daily report. Are you a journalist? Are you some?
I'm far from a journalist. No, I suppose I got involved in writing up on COP when it came to Glasgow. I live here in Glasgow. I've been living in Scotland for 15 years. And I really thought, being at the heart of it, and obviously mainstream, we're taking a key role there. We had a number of events on, particularly on the first week. And, we're very active as a stakeholder in global decarbonisation. So I really wanted to embrace that. And I found that people didn't know enough about it. But I have to say, since Glasgow, we went out on a high in Glasgow. I thought it was one of the best COPs there, obviously outside of the Paris Agreement. But We've really let ourselves down over the last few years. It has been quite disappointing. And I've continued to write just very high level summaries. I got some really good feedback at the one I did in Glasgow. But I think where the disappointment is, and this is on my side as well, it hasn't been as impactful as it has, say, coming from the Glasgow side. I'm really hoping and pinning a lot of hopes on Brazil next year.
What year was Glasgow?
Glasgow was in 2021. I think it was slightly delayed because of the pandemic. So it was in November 2021. And since we've had Egypt, we've had Sharm el Sheikh, we've had Dubai last year, and now Baku this year. So you were looking at, particularly the last 2 years have been petrostate countries. So hence the influence there from the fossil fuel lobby has been quite heavy, I would say. And then obviously that drives behaviors and drives limitations within the negotiations, which is really disappointing.
Are they not seeing the writing on, because I thought everything followed capital and profit. And I wonder, are they not seeing the writing on the wall and rushing to invest in renewables, knowing that what they're involved in is short-term gain?
Yeah, it's unfortunately not as simple as that. There's a lot of key stakeholders who've strong investment portfolios in fossil fuels. And look, we've seen some interesting comments from the host country and the president of COP this year around the place for fossil fuels and the lobbying that goes behind, I suppose, the fossil fuel lobby are equally, if not more, present at these COP gatherings as well. So we are seeing their power, and obviously they've a wealth of funding behind them as well. So it is quite a challenge, and certainly in the negotiation rooms, it has and continues to be a point of conflict. You probably have seen Mary Robinson over the years getting very emotional. She's very passionate about making sure that we take the right steps and the key decisions here to unlock decarbonisation. But what is very evident within COP in particular is the presence of climate frontier countries in particular, looking at those indigenous communities, which are really at the forefront of climate change. They do bring a number of these delegations right into the heart of COP, into the blue zone.
Because I know that Mary Robinson injects emotion into
Yes.
when she speaks from her heart as well as her head. And that's very powerful. And I see that these indigenous people or countries who are in the forefront of suffering because of climate change really
Yeah.
bring an element of immediacy and emotion and reality to the table.
Absolutely. What Mary Robinson has done over the years has been incredible, working as a High Commissioner and just really relaying and translating the importance of why we need to do this and showing that evidence base. And the evidence base is pretty cruel. It's the devastation that we are seeing, particularly the impact it could have on island nations because of rising sea levels and some of the natural disasters and intensities on some of the natural disasters that we've seen over the last decade. And we're seeing that intensity even in our own climate here. We're seeing the intensity of storms rolling in during the winter quite heavily. We're also seeing impacts of flooding and flood levels hugely impact everyday lives. I worked for a company called Atkins, which was a heavy engineering company in both UK and Ireland. And I saw a colleague, I don't know her very well on a personal level, but I thought it was quite relevant. She works in the water department, really looking at driving change in how we plan water and infrastructure projects. And her own home was flooded because of lack of government and local government interventions around supporting communities and making sure that they're making the right infrastructure investments in to protect some of the communities in the likes of the UK. We've seen Middleton last year flooded heavily. We've never seen the levels of water that have been experienced there by those communities. And right before Christmas last year, these are the things we need to instill into our thinking when we're looking at major infrastructure projects like roads and bridges. We're looking at how we protect our cities. You see the rising levels in both Cork, Galway, Limerick, and Dublin. Where the levels come when the tides come in, we need to be able to make sure that we instill that into how we plan, but equally how we engineer as well. Back in my days, looking at infrastructure in Ireland, we would have put a 20% uplift in for climate change. But I think we're probably pushing the limits of that now if you're looking at infrastructure,
Sorry,
which is
what do you
dated
mean
back.
by a 20% uplift?
What we do in engineering design, you'd have a factor of safety. Say if you had a drainage system, which was in, say, a large infrastructure project, could be a residential property, or it would be a shopping centre, or it could be a road. You would analyze the flood levels there, the water levels, and then you'd put a buffer of usually about 20% there to make sure that you had headroom to mitigate anything extraordinary, I'd say, coming in. And that was a climate change buffer.
Be like the size of the drain that you
Exactly.
have a capacity to take 20% more than what you have analyzed to be the normal. But when
Yeah.
the normal has changed, we're very vulnerable to heavy flooding.
Yeah. One project back in it's pretty much my early engineering days. I mean, I would have been graduate on the design side and then went into construction. But one project in particular, it wasn't a residential, it was part of a big infrastructure project and part was a residential. But that site it was flooded from a man-made capacity initially when we moved into the site. But when we were looking at it, it was very, very shallow, very, very flat, should I say. And we were right beside the sea. So we had to make some really key decisions on protecting that infrastructure. There was going to be subsurface car parking. There was obviously going to be houses quite close to the coastline there. So we had to make sure that we had enough headroom there to make sure those houses did not flood. And thankfully they haven't. I do think every time I pass, I'm going, "Ooh, it's coming close." But it's a case of how do we be smart about is there non-return valves on some of the drainage systems to make sure if an event came for that particular element. I remember it was ship turning in the harbour, highest astronomical tide, and then an uplift on top of that. So it was worst case scenario plus an uplift. We need to instill that into our design regs, making sure planning is looking at that. We assess things like not building houses in floodplains, just being smart and how we take these forward, pragmatic and how we plan
Good.
our
Very good.
infrastructure.
Very good. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was why you think that ordinary people might have resistance to wind farms. Is it a resistance to change? Why is there a sort of an anti-greenism? Do we not like being told what to do? What are your thoughts about that? And
Yeah, it varies globally. I've come across projects where the communities have embraced it and think this is absolutely amazing. One of the projects in past life was in Vietnam, and they really were like, oh my God, this is brilliant. We see an opportunity for tourism, attracting an industry and looking at enhancing our lifestyles here because they were a very poor community. They didn't have very much industry in the area and they saw it as a real opportunity, particularly around tourism. And then you go to some parts of Western Europe and they see it as a threat to tourism. I suppose it goes down to core values and personal core values. It's very subjective. And this is where stakeholder engagement is really important to sit down with people and truly explain the why and how and what the bigger vision is, and making sure that you can be able to translate that into layman's language and actually give time to communities to understand this. I understand absolutely. I get it. Not in my backyard.
not in my backyard,
No.
NIMBYism. But I suppose if people are educated, if it
Yeah,
starts in schools with school children on the curriculum, it'll just be normal to
yeah.
them.
It comes down to, and I mentioned this earlier about the importance of having an evidence base and making sure that you have your evidence base, particularly around environmental impact. And this is imperative to get right. So making sure that you have, in the case of offshore, you need to make sure you have 2 years of data for birds and mammals. So that'd be air and sea. And then it's a case of, right, if we have a debate and we have a concern around building in a particular area with a particular technology, how do we make sure that we are de-risking this? We're doing this in a sustainable factor and we are limiting any environmental impact there. Things like noise does have an impact on mammals. There are various technology advancements that we can do to mitigate some of the noise. So looking at noise reduction techniques, and that takes it part of the way. In particular, in the likes of the whales, noise is a concern, particularly in New Jersey of the US. But it's looking at that evidence base and making sure that we have the right case here because some of the disinformation has been quite powerful and it has been weaponized in some cases of some projects, not saying everything, but we need to make sure that we're comparing apples with apples here. There is a lot going on in our oceans, whether it's from a noise perspective, from projects going in, it's from marine craft, pleasure, and commercial. What's happening with changing of our oceans, whether it's from the case of the Gulf Stream is undergoing some changes. You're seeing a lot of changes, particularly in the lobster side of the east coast of the US. You're seeing the migration of some of the species further north because of the increase in temperature of oceans. You're seeing impacts around their food, in particular, the likes of kittiwakes, the likes of sand eels depleted in the seabed, and they're a food source for the likes of kittiwakes. So you're seeing the puffins as well being also impacted. And then in the last couple of years, we've had bird flu. So there is a lot of elements that we need to take into consideration.
Yes, whatever damage renewable energy does, it certainly doesn't do as much damage as climate change. So it seems like a little bit of a false.
Well, we need to balance it up and make sure that we have the right evidence. We need to have the backup there because we could be in an endless debate otherwise. You look at, say, aviation industry around airports, and obviously they have challenges around birds and bird strikes when it comes to aviation side, but having that right evidence base to say, look, we estimate there will be an impact of this. And you are seeing that being written into policy and regulatory frameworks now, particularly if you look at our neighbours in the Celtic Sea are going to be running an auction next year for floating wind. And one of the key attributes is environmental net gain. It's how you're going to improve that environment. How are you going to enhance it? And I can only speak from an offshore wind perspective on this one, but we are seeing a lot of benefits come out of, say, where there have been artificial reefs or, around cable protection. You generally rock dump around some of these or you have buried cables. And actually, on some of those rock dumps, you have seen new and emerging species. You're seeing enhancement of the species in the area because they're getting an opportunity to take a breath and actually regenerate, particularly around, say, if you have areas of no take, and obviously you're seeing no take areas around special areas of conservation now being put forward by the Europeans.
Would be no take.
In
Yeah.
areas of no take or where there'd be marine areas of conservation and strategic areas of conservation are key to making sure that we maintain a healthy balance and regeneration within our fish stocks and our birds and mammals and elements like that. It all plays in. It's not just one element. We do need to be very mindful about what we do. We need to make sure that all practices, and I'll say this across the marine sector, the renewable sector, the commercial sectors that go into the marine environment, we all need to make sure we play our part and streamline what we're doing and really, truly bring change into how we operate in the marine environment.
I just would like to ask you, Una, what would be maybe three things you would hope that Ireland might achieve in the next 5 years?
Coming from my work in offshore wind in particular, I really think we need, I'm hoping and more than hoping, we're really trying to drive change in the policy and regulatory side. We've made some really key moves and made a lot of ground in policy and regulatory side, but our delivery of offshore wind in Ireland in particular, that would be one of my top hopes. And I think it's imperative we get this right and we need to do it at pace. So that would be key. In Ireland, unlocking the grid is another one, making sure that we help ourselves here. I think it's really important, not just from a renewable energy perspective, but from actually a social and economic perspective. We need to make sure that we defend our business case for why you would invest in Ireland, why we have a great lifestyle here. Okay, we've got a challenge in our cost of living. We need to get that cost of living down. We need to get the electricity price down. And my hope is renewable energy could be transformative in that side. My third one is getting that social license and really sitting down. It's not just up to one or two individuals or one or two companies. It needs to go, as you mentioned earlier, we need to go down to grassroots. We need to educate in schools, making sure that we understand the technology, we understand the why we're doing this on a global level, why and how it's important to Ireland and how you can play your part. I think that is going to be key because we're not going to get projects over the line. We're not going to get the high level of judicial review in Ireland in particular. It's pretty frightening. I think it was last year, every single project on the onshore side had some element of a JR. It had a judicial review. I remember being at a conference in January of this year, and every single project that went into the planning system within the last year, actually the night previous, it was one project was still untouched. And by the time we got up in the morning, the last project had been put into JJ. Yeah, we need to think about how we manage judicial review process, why this is happening, and understanding how we can streamline this a little bit better. We've seen the environmental court being set up, and I think that's been really helpful.
Good.
But we need to do more.
Because judicial review could have a lot of vested interests in delaying and
absolutely, yeah. But it's the timeline. It's the timeline for that debate. We need to make sure that, again, we have the evidence base. You can prove your case if it's in favor. If a developer has missed a step and if a developer has not gone through the due process, that is a different thing. And that is the onus on us. It all comes down to quality of the delivery of the developments, making sure that you have the right evidence base. And then if you can tick those boxes and it has the business case for investment, it is a viable project. It should go through and be built, but it needs to be built in a timely and robust fashion.
Maybe I'll talk to you again in 3 years and we can
Yeah,
go
hopefully.
through some of these. Thank you, Una. You're obviously been living in Scotland and working in Scotland, which has
Yeah.
wonderful offshore energy. And Ireland is going to have three more projects, I believe, that are being built now, aren't they? Yes.
The projects in the offshore side are actually all going through planning at the minute. So it's a really pivotal point for Ireland if we can get this moving. The projects that are in development at the minute are just after entering the planning side. These need to be built by 2030, 2030 ideally, to hit our renewable energy targets and the repercussions as well. And this is a monetary one. If we do not hit our repercussions, there are monetary
Oh, I'm lovely.
penalties. The penalties we get for not decarbonising is pretty considerable. So we do need to be mindful of that. We need to ensure that we support these projects and we are de-risking these projects as best we can. But there's another phase of projects that need to come through behind that if we're truly going to build an offshore wind industry. And I have been working on this with I think I did my first presentation in the Marion Hotel in 2017 on offshore wind and why you should do it. But I mean, look, the person who has been really trailblazing on this has been Eddie O'Connor in his early days of building the Arklow Bank.
Una Brosnan, you're definitely a trailblazer. One final question. If you were a teenager today and considering a career in the green economy, which is what the future economy will be, it'll all be green, in my view, what area would you go into? Would you still go into engineering or would you recommend engineering or technology? It's also exciting.
I'm an engineer by trade. I'm a chartered civil engineer. I worked, as I say, in construction. I would say engineering is a great basis, whether you go into it in depth or you go in as a generalist. I'm more a generalist now. I consider myself a translator. I've had a long career working really with amazing minds and just they get the detail. They want to solve problems. But that wasn't for me. I wanted to do I suppose I liked more tangible projects, which were on the delivery side. It was just a different area, whereas they were really on the innovation side. I'm really keen on the innovation translation to get them to commercialization. That was my niche. And I would encourage anyone getting into engineering. It's a fantastic opportunity to enter a world of its pace, it's interesting. There is not a dull moment here at all.
Thank you, Una. Thank you very much. Do you have to be good at maths?
You do, you do. But you'd be surprised if you're doing the design side. Yes, it is critical. But if you're looking at and your mind is shaped in a different way around building things, you don't need the maths to the level you would be expecting. At that practical and visualization side is huge. I will never be an architect, or I probably would never go out and heavily see an opportunity to change elements within the construction side. But we see individuals who've come through apprenticeships or have come and just grown up in the building trade through family businesses and the vision and the expertise that comes through there. In some cases, some of these may not have had third level
It's
education, but
yeah,
it's the vision and the ability.
yeah, it's so exciting to be on the cutting edge of all this change, and the world needs it, the climate needs it. So there's a sort of a sense of saving the world and being involved in engineering. So thank you so much, Una Brosnan. I was so happy to have you here in Cornucopia Climate Chats and so happy for our customers to be able to hear you. Thank you for your work in helping on the planet and offshore energy.